What is up, y'all? Kevin Kuhn here from Athlete Factors. This is the Athlete Factors podcast. My guest today is Dr. Kate Harrison. How you doing today?
I'm great, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. So, you work for BOA Technology. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what you do there, and then we'll get into the fun stuff.
Yeah, so I guess starting quite a ways back, I was always super into sports as a kid, and ultimately was best at running, and that was my primary interest. And so going into university education, was going to run at West Virginia University, and was just obsessed with running and science, and so chose to study exercise physiology, and have kind of been on that road ever since. I ultimately did a master's there in exercise physiology, and then my PhD in rehabilitation and movement science at Virginia Commonwealth University, focusing on running biomechanics and injury and performance. And currently I'm at BOA Technology, working on footwear development and how that relates to athlete performance.
Very cool. So it's kind of a funny story how, the world is a very small place. It's a very big place, but it's a tiny place at the same time. So two of your former teammates were camp counselors at an Athletes in Action Tough Camp, which is a high school running camp, and I was a counselor there too. So so I know Anna Lewis and Stephanie Caruso pretty well, and it's just crazy that the world's tiny.
Yeah, definitely is a small world, so super cool to kind of get in touch.
There's also the layer of, for a while, I wanted to do my PhD with Dr. Greg Hoff, and he was your professor, so.
Yeah, he was my undergrad advisor, and could definitely see why you'd want to study with him. He did lots of great work on strength and conditioning that definitely kind of piqued my interest and got me to delve further into the field for sure.
Yeah, he was like my first exposure to the idea of periodization for your diet, and I was like, what in the world is this? This is a thing? So I nerded out big time at an ISSN nutrition conference one time where he was speaking, and I was like, oh my goodness, I got to learn more from this guy. So that's good stuff. So you've mentioned, your background in running. You ran, collegiately at West Virginia, but you've also been able to represent your home country of Canada a few times. So tell us a little bit about, your athletic background specifically with running, and kind of what your ideal distances are and what your training was like and all of that.
For sure. So I have been a distance runner, so definitely focused on, cross country through high school, and then in college ended up kind of really finding my groove in the 5K and 10K. Running at West Virginia with Sean Cleary. He's a Canadian coach there, and there's a pretty large Canadian contingent of athletes there. And so I was always really supportive of opportunities to represent Canada and making that a goal. So I did get to represent Canada at the World Cross Country Championships a couple of times, and just had a real distance runner kind of strength and background. And so even now I'm still training. Has not been a lot of racing, obviously, over the past year and a half, but hopefully we'll try my hand at the marathon going forwards. And so it continues to kind of be a big part of my life.
That's awesome. That's so cool. So what is the change been like from 5K, 10K training to marathon training?
Yeah, not a massive change, I would say. The background I came up through West Virginia with was definitely a strength, as in strength endurance when runners refer to strength, I guess we're referring to the long tempo, not the strength of the
Not
strength and conditioning world.
not running around in the weight room. That's not strength for
Yes,
runners.
definitely need to translate that. But so very long, lots of long tempo type training. So definitely building up the long run a little bit has been a focus. Maybe from like the 16 to 17 mile range, trying to get up more in the 20 range, definitely, and push a little past that once we finally get into a really focused marathon training block.
That's awesome. Very cool. Well, best of luck. And yeah, I'm sure I'm going to stay tuned to see how all that goes. But I'm excited about that. So, if you will, tell us a little bit more about what you were studying specifically in grad school, like both your master's and your PhD, and how that's translated to what you're doing now.
Yeah. So starting with my master's, there was definitely kind of a shift from master's to PhD. But as I said, I studied exercise physiology, so I had the kind of a broader background ranging from physiology to biomechanics. And so right as I was making the transition from undergrad to master's, it was right around the time that barefoot running was very big in in not only the research world, but definitely making its way into more kind of Runner's World magazine and more mainstream type of outlets. And so for better or for worse, that was definitely very effective in kind of grabbing my attention and starting to make me wonder about how footwear and biomechanics would relate to athlete performance. It wasn't something I really knew a lot about. And so I ultimately studied with Dr. Jean McCrory at West Virginia University, and her focus was in biomechanics. And actually, her specific interest was in the biomechanics of pregnancy. So got into considering female biomechanics and function and how that was related to pregnancy, and also got to work on some side projects looking at foot anthropometry and barefoot running. And I think from that, knew I had a goal to work in industry, just because I knew that that would give me an opportunity to really focus on athlete performance throughout my career. And so when I transitioned into my PhD program at Virginia Commonwealth University, I was working with Blaze Williams and studying running biomechanics and how that related to injury primarily, actually. It was a kind of more clinically focused program in a physical therapy department. And so my specific project was looking at novice runners who we know tend to be at a bit of a higher risk for injury, and trying to understand why that might be and how we can start to prevent that.
Awesome. So that brings us to the topic essentially for today's podcast, which is like, what the heck is good running form, and are there differences between novice and experienced runners and all that? So if you could condense running form into a bit of a primer, like is there a standard? Like, is there, like, okay, so I watch a lot of track and field on TV, and like some people just look beautiful when they run. And then there's some runners who can run just as fast, and it's like they look like they're hurting. Like it does not look comfortable at all, but like whatever, they get it done. So is there an ideal running form that people should work towards? And is there this standard, or is it kind of as long as you can put one foot in front of the other, it's like it's all good?
Yeah, I think it's maybe funny to say as a biomechanist that wouldn't say maybe there's an ideal running form, and I would hesitate to try and push an ideal running form. I think that can be a bit alienating, and just running should be a simple sport, and would never want people to think, oh, I'm doing it wrong, or worry about trying to attain something based on how a pro runner looks on TV. And I think there's some really strong evidence to back that up. So a good example would be, let's say, stride frequency. And there's a lot of talk about, how many steps per minute should I take and what's the optimal cadence. But a few studies now have actually shown that runners are really good at they're self-selecting their natural cadence right at about what's optimal for their running economy and performance. Another kind of hot button issue in biomechanics has been forefoot and rear foot striking. And quite similarly, actually Alison Gruber and Joe Hamill have published a nice paper for anyone interested, but really summarizing and delving into all the literature available on that have came to the conclusion that there's no benefit in terms of performance or injury in forefoot versus rear foot striking. And so it seems that whatever people are doing now, whatever they're naturally doing, seems to work pretty well for them.
I'm going to pause you there because that's a very interesting idea, right? So for the longest time, the I don't know if you'd call it the general consensus, but there's been like a decent amount of agreement that like, hey, heel striking that's a braking force, right? So now you're unable to absorb these ground reaction forces through soft tissue. Now most of that's going to be absorbed through bone and joint, and that's probably not good. That's going to lead to stress fractures or just a different subset of overuse injuries versus soft tissue injuries. So do we know if that's related to where you're making contact relative to your center of gravity or your center of mass? Like if you're heel striking way out in front of you, like is that the same as making a flat foot contact or heel strike like right underneath you? Like are there differences between those two things?
Right. Certainly there are differences, and I think you actually made a good point there in that it might subject you to a different subset of injuries or forces. And so I think deciding that one is better or worse is probably impossible, and that it might just be that if you happen to be a forefoot striker, you might subject your Achilles to more load and your lower leg muscles, and so you might be more prone to those types of injuries. Whereas to your point, maybe if you are a pretty extreme heel striker, you might be more prone to things like stress fractures or knee pain. I think the other important note there is we often maybe classify it as a binary thing, forefoot versus rear foot striker, but there's certainly a whole spectrum, and it might be more useful to think of it that way, in that if you are an extreme heel striker and kind of landing way out in front of you on your heel and slamming into the ground, maybe that's something that could be addressed if it's really exaggerated. And similarly, if you're way up on your toes and kind of prancing and your heel never hits the ground, maybe that's something that equally would need to be addressed if it caused issues.
Yeah, there was a guy on my cross country and track team in college who like was always in the training room before and after practice, getting his calves massaged and like getting all this soft tissue work done on his calves. His heels never touched the ground, and he was a marathon runner. And we're all like, dude, maybe there might be some changes you could make here, but like that was the way he ran. And it's just one of those interesting, observations. Shalea Kipp, when I had her on the podcast, she talked about how like she's a pretty heavy heel striker, and that was important when it came to the steeplechase because every single person, at least with the water jump, but I think it might be even every barrier, your first foot contact after a barrier, everybody touches their heels down. So even if you're a midfoot striker or a forefoot striker, like when you land after a barrier, your heels are going to touch. And so if you're doing a ton of volume, especially with a water jump, and you're a forefoot striker, you probably are going to have some serious heel pain. You're going to have some issues. So if you're naturally a heel striker and then you go into doing practice water jumps and stuff like that, you're probably going to be a little more acclimated to those levels of ground reaction force, which in their study, I think were like 7 times body weight. Like
Yeah,
there's
pretty
some
crazy.
serious level ground reaction force there. So if you're not accustomed to that, and then boom, you start doing jumps, like maybe you're gonna have to not do a whole lot of jumps right away. Like you're gonna have to ease into it. So I that just reminded me of that thing that she had brought up, and that's so interesting because I was like, what? She's super elite. Like she's so elite. She ran
Yeah.
in the Olympics. She's a heel striker. What? No. Like my whole notion of no, there is a running standard. Everybody should run this way. Like, no. My mind was getting blown. So, and I kind of knew that because there's just some people who run so fast who have very little injury history, and they don't look athletic when they're running.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. For
The
sure.
body finds a way to do it. It's
And it's
incredible.
comforting too, right? Just to think, oh no, I don't have to try and go through all these complex changes. Just one layer of complexity we can hopefully, for the most part, strip away, and just do your thing.
For sure. So there's no quote unquote good form, but are there things that everyone should probably be mindful of or try to be aware of when it comes to minimizing risk or maximizing performance?
Yeah, so I think there is one thing that seems to come up pretty regularly in running literature, and that would be less so focused on the sagittal plane or like kind of the straightforward and backward movements, and get into a little bit more of the nuanced movements of the side to side and rotational movements that your joints undergo with every step. And some of that is absolutely necessary. It helps your body kind of to absorb impact with every step. But particularly at the knee, if we get excessive collapse, if we look at the body of work that's been done in running, looking at some of the hip collapse and hip adduction, and then even borrowing from court and field sports showing higher risk of knee injury with a knee valgus or knee abduction, whatever term you want to use for it, being pretty consistently and strongly linked to knee injury. I think that might be something that all athletes, whether you're a runner, when you're running, every step is a single leg landing, and so I think we can take a lot from basketball and volleyball, and maybe want to focus a little bit on learning to control with each landing, just that we're not completely collapsing in that the frontal and transverse planes. All that's to say, we know that maybe too much is bad, but the line for how much is too much is still really not clear. So we can't look at runner and say, oh, you collapsed too much and you collapsed just the right amount. But I would certainly say if, let's say, you do tend to have knee injuries, that would be a sign that might be something that you want to consider and maybe work with a physical therapist on.
Or a kinesiologist like myself.
Yes.
Because like in my practice, that's what I do a lot of is measuring single leg squats and looking at joint angles passively. And there's times where just watching somebody run, you might not see anything, but then watching them do a single leg squat where there's excessive knee valgus, I'm like, okay, so I just watched them jog, but it was only 50 yards, right? Like when they're 3 or 4 or 10 miles in or 15 miles into a long run, like sure there's some change in mechanics, and maybe that's where the knee pain starts to show up. So but yeah, that's one of those things. How much is too much? Like that's a tough one. I know when I see a lot of it and the athlete has pain, I know if we fix it, that pain's going to go away. But I can't be like, we're at, at this level, and if we go to this level, that's where things are going to be really bad. Like, I have no idea.
For
So,
sure.
So that's kind of let's transition from there to differences between, say, men and women.
Yeah. So I think that is a really interesting question, and I think a question that hasn't maybe gotten as much attention as it deserves in literature, but definitely starting to come to the forefront is something that's really important. I think before we even get into the differences, there are certainly more similarities than differences where, men and women, everyone's putting one foot in front of the other. And so given that, basic task of running is moving forwards, in the sagittal plane, we don't really see too many differences. They're pretty similar. But when you talk about those frontal plane differences, many researchers have now noted that women do tend to display a larger range of motion in the frontal plane, at the knee and the hip in particular.
So for the lay person, that's just like sagittal plane, like when you're looking at somebody running from in front or behind, like men and women basically, no difference. But when you're looking at them from a side view, that's where we're starting to notice some changes.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
exactly. And the reason for those changes aren't entirely clear, at least not yet. And it's been pretty widely hypothesized that, women have a different skeletal structure and maybe wider hips contribute to that. And a few authors have looked into that and found, that explains maybe a small fraction of the difference between men and women. So it could just be, potential differences in tendon and ligament laxity, for example, or stiffness. So we don't really entirely know why, but we do know that men and women do have these kind of general differences, and that plays into the fact that they also tend to report a little bit of variation in the types of injury. So overall, if you look at male and female runners, they tend to report similar overall rates of injury. But if you break it down by injury type, men maybe are more prone to things like Achilles tendonitis or patellar tendonitis, and women tend to report more patellofemoral pain syndrome and IT band syndrome. And so I think when we start to see those discrepancies in injury, it becomes really important to understand why are they seeing differences in their injury types, and how can we kind of address those two groups to better address their injury profiles.
Gotcha. So some of it is structural differences, like maybe Q angle, maybe like you said, joint laxity. But I'm surprised that it's a fraction maybe of accounting for injury. Like, that's crazy to me. That blows my mind.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's still something we're working on, and so no perfect answers yet, but I think hopefully some more answers are forthcoming in the next decade or so.
Awesome. Well, that's good. Like, that's, if we don't know and we aren't studying it, then like we're leaving a ton of not only performance on the table, but like we're just leaving ourselves open to injuries that don't have to happen. These are not contact sport injuries. These are, almost all of them are overuse injuries. So, we can prevent those if we know what to look for and if we know how to address them. But if we're not paying attention because we're like, oh, all runners are the same, then come on.
Yeah,
we got to be better than that.
Absolutely, I agree.
So we know there's some variation in general between the way that men and women run. So what are some of the differences between a novice runner and a more experienced runner?
Yeah, so that was a question I took a pretty deep dive into during my dissertation work. And so I started with a project taking a group of people who had never run regularly and compared them, and these were all females, and compared them to a group of women who had been running, at least 3 days a week for over a year. And looking back into research that was done before, there have been a couple of studies that hadn't found any differences, let's say in the peak hip angle during the stance phase. So when your foot's in contact with the ground, your hip's going to collapse a little bit towards the midline of the body in the frontal plane. And they didn't see any differences in the maximum value of that angle between novice and experienced runners, or any relationship between the number of years you had run, let's say, and some of those primary variables. But some other authors like Christian Claremont in Calgary and Catherine Boyer from UMass had done some work looking at high versus low mileage runners. So maybe this isn't necessarily exactly novice versus experienced, but high mileage runners have typically spent years building up to that volume, and every week obviously kind of accumulate more miles than someone running half as much. And so we can pretty distinctively say that a high mileage runner is more experienced in terms of total running volume than a low mileage runner. And in comparing those two groups, there are some differences that again seem to surface primarily in the frontal and the transverse plane. And so that could be just that over a long-term adaptation that experienced runners tend to find a way to run that puts them maybe at a lower risk of injury. All runners get hurt pretty frequently, so it's definitely not a silver bullet, but it might kind of mitigate their risk somewhat in kind of those frontal and transverse plane differences.
Yeah, that's something that I think about every once in a while is your body's going to adapt to make you more efficient, but particularly when it comes to endurance athletics, I'm not entirely convinced that becoming more efficient also makes you more resilient to injury. Like, does that make sense? Am I like,
Yeah.
Do I sound crazy?
No, I think that is an interesting question. Like, is it a trade-off between injury and performance, or do they both come together? I think there's a good, maybe theoretically in my mind, you'd think if you're got a lot of motion in the frontal plane, that's probably not the most useful motion if your goal is to move forwards as fast as possible. So I think there's a good theoretical argument there that maybe if you control your frontal plane motions a little bit better, that could make you more efficient. And I think there is not a ton of evidence or research into that, but one study at least showing that more efficient runners do tend to have less range of motion in the frontal plane. I think the other aspect to that question is there's so much that goes into running efficiency aside from your biomechanics, how like your tissue properties, for example, and your physiology. So it's definitely hard to really fully understand the relationship between those two.
Yeah. So when I see someone who's run every day for 50 years, like somebody who's in their 60s or 70s, and they are a runner, and all they do is every day they're checking the box, I ran, right? So they should be as efficient at running as like humanly possible, right? Like in theory, right? Because if like that's the activity and that's what they're doing every day, and many times their hip mobility is not great. Yep. in any plane of motion, and like here's where that idea that I was explaining earlier of like becoming efficient at a movement doesn't necessarily mean you're resilient, right? Because if all they've done is run, then their body is like, okay, we don't need this extra range of motion when it comes to hip flexion and extension. We're not getting there while we run. Let's lock those hip flexors down. Let's lock the glutes down a little bit. Like, let's just limit all that. Let's keep us right here in this tiny range because that's all we're moving in. So that's one of those things that like that's the body doing its job. Like that's what our body's designed to do. It's like the nervous system and the rest of our bodies. Like we've got to survive. We've got to be as efficient with these calories as possible, whatever we're getting in. How do we budget this? How do we limit, how much we're expending? What if there's a famine tomorrow? What are we doing here? Like, let's lock it down. So I think that's one of those interesting things when it comes to running specifically that I think is very different from, many other sports. Because you're taking that into account, but then what most people don't think about, like you said, is the mechanics of what's going on in that frontal plane and transverse plane. Like, the knee is a hinge joint in general, but the tibia rotates, right? There's movement there. The arch absorbs force, but your foot pronates and supinates. Like there's inversion and eversion. Like the hip, the femur rotates, right? Like there's all of these. This is three-dimensional stuff. There's no such thing as just front side, back side mechanics anymore. Like we can't afford to look at things that way. So yeah, I think I just went off on a little bit of a rabbit trail there, but like it's so crazy that more people I don't think are spending enough time learning about this stuff. And because it's complex, like as soon as you add in frontal plane, like now, okay, you've just multiplied what form is supposed to be by a ton more variables. And then you add in the transverse plane. It's like, oh, are you kidding me? Like there's infinite amounts of data that you have to consider now.
Sure.
Yeah, and we're just talking about the stance phase. Like there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on, but that's where the force is taking place, right? Like the absorption and then the application of new force or recycling of force. So
yeah, no, I totally agree. It's a fascinating question, and I think one of my also kind of passion projects that came up through this project was looking at the coordination of the ankle and the hip and in the frontal and transverse planes, as you mentioned. The knee is a hinge joint. You have, your quadriceps and hamstrings that are big muscles moving your knee in the sagittal plane, so flexing and extending your knee. And yet there's all this complexity of motion at your ankle and your hip, and how those two joints kind of coordinate and work together in positioning the knee, like you said, in rotation and in the frontal plane, I think is really interesting and not something we fully understand yet.
Yeah, as soon as I kind of started to learn that, the way that we view muscles based off an anatomy textbook is not the way that things look or work in real life. Like, rectus femoris. This is a hip flexor and it's a knee extensor. And then, you've got the other muscles of the quad. You've got vastus medialis, you've got vastus lateralis. And it's like, yeah, okay, well, like, I'm looking at it in a textbook and I can understand like, oh, okay, yeah, just the quad muscles extend the knee. Yeah. But like, there's a ton of wraparound. Like that vastus lateralis is overlapping a ton with IT band and with the fascial connections of the TFL and the fascial connections of the glute fibers. And so, because that's all going into the IT band as well. So like, there's a lot of play there. Like we don't just go forwards and backwards and side to side and diagonal. Like we're doing like all of that sometimes at the same time. So it's complex stuff. Sure. But it's worth learning about. It's worth studying. So thank you. So let's talk a little bit more about the specific differences between novice runners and experienced runners, at least in female runners.
Yeah. So when I compared the novice runners to experienced runners, we did see that looking during the stance phase that the novice runners had a higher degree of knee abduction or knee valgus. So their knee was collapsing in more so than the experienced runners. So presumably from what we know about knee injuries and the link to biomechanics, that's probably not an ideal movement pattern. And so that might help to explain why novice runners tend to experience more injury in a mile per week. That might be, a fraction of their total weekly mileage. And so the relative increase is pretty small, but when the novice runner goes and runs a mile or two during their first week, that's a pretty huge increase in load for their body. And so that certainly would put them potentially at a higher risk. But these movement patterns could also play a role. And so understanding what those movement patterns are and how long does it take to change? Do they change within a runner as they train? Do we need to be prescribing kind of more specific instructions or drills or anything? Is really kind of wanted to get at with that project.
Gotcha. So what were your conclusions on that part? Like, are there things that you recommend novice runners do so that they end up looking more like experienced runners?
Yeah. So I think there's a few different ways to approach this problem. And from a research standpoint, we don't fully have those answers. Hopefully I'll be working on a paper looking at first just the question of, presumably with time, just following a good training program and being really consistent, let's say with a Couch to 5K program. If a novice runner is patient and builds up slowly, hopefully those adaptations would occur. At what point, does it take 3 months, 6 months? Does it take 3 years? We don't really know, but I think a patient approach, that's always a good, solid baseline recommendation. I also think it could be worthwhile, again, borrowing from, basketball, soccer, lacrosse, those types of court and field sports where even more severe knee injuries, such as ACL tears, are really common. And they've had great success there with plyometric interventions. And so doing a lot of, jumping and landing and bounding type of drills does seem to be pretty effective in helping athletes learn to control those movements better and be able to absorb those forces more effectively. So I think there's potential that maybe those could also be effective in runners. And so that was also something that will be part of the next part coming out of my dissertation. I don't think we have any definitive answers yet, but again, I think becoming stronger, never a bad recommendation.
Gotcha. So you think that runners, especially distance runners, need to be strength training?
I would say yes. I would agree with that statement.
Good. I'm so glad that whole idea has changed dramatically over the past, 10, 20 years, because that wasn't a thing when I started running, and plenty of my current clients who 10 years ago, they weren't doing that. They weren't lifting. Yeah. Even now it's no. They'll lift upper body, they'll do some core, but they're like, no, I run enough. I run a ton. I don't need to lift with my legs. Come on, please. This is going to help you.
It's been a nice reference actually lately, given the popularity of shoes, and not to get too off topic, but this 4% number has really kind of had a huge impact, and 4% now means a lot. And when you look at a lot of these studies looking at heavy strength training or plyometric interventions in runners, they get anywhere from 2 to 8%, so really similar benefits. And so any runner, they're leaving that on the table. And if you look at the effect that running shoes have had on the current landscape of running, to imagine that some runners are leaving that on the table because they don't want to do some strength training, I think is hopefully that's enough to convince them.
I think so. I mean, I strength train. right? Like I understand the benefit of it, and I try to convey that to to every runner that I know, whether they're dealing with injuries or not, or whether they have lofty racing goals, or whether they're just they just like to run. Like, hey, this will make it better. This will take you to another level. Like it's not just performance benefit. It's also injury prevention benefit. Like you're more resilient, so that means you can apply more force because now you can absorb more force. Like this is a good thing. So I think that's awesome. So if you had to tie this all up in a neat bundle, like what would your general recommendations be for any runner, whether they're just starting out or whether they've been doing it a long time? What kind of advice do you have based off kind of what you've learned and what you know and what you theorize for where things are heading for runners in the future?
Yeah, it would always be nice to have more definitive answers. I think as someone who spends their life researching this, to say, oh, we just need to do more research is. But I think, starting off with, don't try to chase some specific type of running form. I think that's, a really unnecessary stress to put on running. And I think however you run is probably great for your body structure. And the point at which you might want to consider making changes is if you're having problems, specifically injuries that are recurring in the same spot, and then working with a trained person, whether, to your point, a physical therapist or kinesiologist or someone who's understands what movement patterns might be related to the injuries you're experiencing. They can definitely help provide you some guidance and take a lot of the guesswork out of that. And as we just, finished up discussing, I think strength training, it could potentially, especially if you're doing kind of explosive movements that are more specific to running. Running is, jumping and landing several times for, thousands of steps. And so getting really good at jumping and landing, I think hopefully it might help improve your movement patterns, but certainly it will help improve the integrity of your tissues and make them more resilient and robust to injury and help your performance. So I think that is definitely one good takeaway from what we know so far, and looking forward to learning more.
Awesome. Oh, I just thought of one more question. So when it comes to strength training, what do you think? Do you think that there's maybe too much emphasis on strength training in the sagittal plane and not enough emphasis on strength training in the frontal or transverse plane?
That's a good question. I think one thing that's interesting in trying to understand maybe why some people do have more range of motion in the frontal plane than another, they've actually found that a person's strength, at least how strength is typically measured in a clinic, let's say, is really has a very poor relation or none at all to their movement patterns during running. And so I think that suggests that maybe just making these muscles stronger isn't going to make you move any better. So I think there's definitely a control component. And so not that it's people shouldn't strengthen them. I think especially after injuries, a lot of time there's weakness that may even just result from being inhibited from pain that might need to be addressed. So not that it shouldn't be strengthened, but I think definitely including some control type exercises, like whether it's a single leg exercise where you really have to use your glute medius and control that movement to keep your hips fairly level, is important, and trying to incorporate that into the sagittal plane activities potentially would be really effective.
Awesome. Because like I have my clients, so there's the strength coach Dan John, and I'm not sure if he kind of developed this way of programming, but he basically sets it up to where just about every session, whether you're training every day or whether you're training, twice a week or 3 times a week, should have a squat pattern, a hip hinge pattern, upper body pushes, upper body pulls in like a weighted carry. So he trains primarily track and field throwers, like shot put, discus, that sort of thing. And, like they're doing a ton of rotation for both the throws, right? So he, in general, he's like, that's bread and butter. That's what you need to be doing every day. Like, don't always train so that it looks exactly like in the weight room. Don't train so that it looks like your sport. Like, so he looks at strength and conditioning as more, I think, of like a general physical preparation sort of thing. Like, just make the body resilient, just be strong, and then train your sport. And there's some carryover with runners. I don't think it's as seamless trying to just like, okay, just do some squats and deadlifts and hip hinges and upper body work and weighted carries and do that and then go run. Like, I'm not sure there's as much carryover. Like, I think it is more important to focus on those movement patterns for sure. But then, because running, the end result of running is sagittal plane. But because there is so much frontal plane and transverse plane wiggle room, let's say, because the body has to use these joints and motions, internal rotation of the tibia and hip abduction and adduction and all this stuff. It's using that to get you to just go forward. I think it's extremely important to train less in the sagittal plane in the weight room and train way more in the frontal plane. So not just doing a squat, but doing a lateral squat or doing a 90-degree rotation squat, doing, like lunging forward for sure, but also lunging in reverse and like working as many of those planes of motion as possible. Like, I see that as being way more helpful for all of my runners and for my cyclists. Like, my triathletes get a ton of benefit from doing non-sagittal plane strength and conditioning because they're already sagittal all the time. Like, so I think that makes runners way more resilient, not just being in the weight room, but being in the weight room working on the planes of motion that aren't quote unquote primary movers.
Right.
Because they end up being stabilizers and secondary movers and stuff like that. And I think we didn't really cover this, but my guess is, like, as a runner fatigues, the amount of motion in the frontal plane and transverse plane probably increases big time because there's less control. Like, as you fatigue, like, things happen. And I think that's, like you said, that's why increasing mileage and increasing volume needs to be like appropriate, because if you make these huge jumps, you're putting yourself at a much higher risk for some serious issues just because your body's not conditioned for that yet. So I don't know. That's kind of my understanding of things currently.
For sure, a patient approach, and I'm not always the best at this. It's easier to give someone else this advice than to take it yourself, but patience always pays off.
I hear that. Yeah. If I don't program out like my running like weeks or months in advance, so like, here's what I'm going to do. If I don't do that, and if I'm just like, I feel like running today, I'll go run this number of miles or this amount of time. Like, I end up, obviously it's not exponential, but it looks way more exponential than it does linear. So,
for sure.
Yeah,
for
it's sure. Like you said, it's way easier to tell somebody how to do that. So, That's crazy stuff. But so if people want to read some of your work, or they want to reach out to you to ask questions, or they want to follow you, what are the best ways to do that?
So I'm probably most active on Twitter. My handle's at running_geek. And
I like it.
Yep. And definitely open if anyone wants to reach out via email. It's kate.harrison@boatechnology.com, and I'm sure you can include those in notes if anyone's looking for it. Love to hear from them.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This has been really awesome. I feel like, I'm slowly but surely getting a better understanding of how to help, myself, and how to help all my, runners and triathletes and endurance athletes. And I wish it were super simple, and it's just like in this 50-minute podcast, we figured everything out.
I think I'd be out of a job if it was simple. So I'm glad it's complicated.
Yes, exactly. So, any sneak peeks on running shoe technology that you want to share with us?
Sneak peeks. Nothing specific, but it is a rapidly advancing field. So I think any other running and shoe geeks, definitely keep your eyes out. It's an exciting space right now for sure.
It sure is. Yeah, quite a few running shoe companies have tried to come out with their like elite racing shoe to match Nike, and I love it. I think it's so cool. So
yeah, fun stuff.
Yes. So awesome. Kate, thank you again for doing this. It's been a really fun conversation, and I've learned quite a bit being able to talk with you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a blast.
For sure. Awesome. Alrighty, y'all. Stay tuned for next week's episode, and go follow Kate. And if you have any questions for her, go ahead and reach out. All right. See y'all next week.